Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a topic that often remains, well, shrouded in geopolitical whispers.
Right.
Russia's grand strategy unfolding across Latin America and the Caribbean.
hmm
You might instinctively think Russia and Latin America, how significant could that really be? But I promise you, the insights we've gathered reveal a surprisingly nuanced and increasingly important global chess match.
Absolutely.
For instance, did you know that since the war in Ukraine, Russian oil product imports to Latin America have surged? We're talking reaching, well, a staggering 300 to 330,000 barrels per day.
That's a huge jump.
It is. Or that Brazil, often called the breadbasket of the world due to its massive agricultural output, has now become the single largest buyer of Russian diesel
Mm.
globally.
Absorbing exports that used to go elsewhere, mainly Europe.
Exactly. And consider this. Countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru collectively hold about two-thirds of the world's proven lithium reserves, that critical material for a green energy future.
Essential state.
And Russia is making very deliberate strategic moves to secure access to those crucial resources.
These aren't just isolated facts, are they? They are threads in a much, much larger tapestry.
That's right.
Our mission today is to take a deep dive into this stack of insights, really revealing Russia's evolving strategy in Latin America and the Caribbean, or LAC, as we'll probably refer to the region.
Good shorthand.
We'll unpack Russia's core motivations for this, let's call it re-engagement. We need to explore how its approach has transformed over time and detail the specific, often quite subtle methods it employs to build influence.
Yeah, even with what might appear, on the surface to be a relatively small footprint.
Exactly. Ultimately, we want to understand the tangible impacts this strategy is having on the region itself and, crucially, on the wider global geopolitical landscape. What's fascinating here, I think, is how global power plays aren't always about overwhelming military might
Mm.
or, blunt economic dominance,
Right.
but often about strategic leverage, finding those niche dependencies, and the careful long-term cultivation of relationships.
That's a crucial point. It reminds us that understanding these global power dynamics isn't just for policymakers or international relations experts. It fundamentally illuminates the incredible interconnectedness of our world. It can shed light on significant shifts in global trade routes, in the acquisition of vital resources, and in the intricate web of international alliances that directly or indirectly affect all of us.
Yeah, it touches everything eventually.
For anyone tracking geopolitical fault lines or just the subtle art of statecraft, this deep dive offers, well, kind of a masterclass in how influence is wielded in the 21st century. So let's peel back the layers on Russia's evolving strategy in Latin America. IFAS, the geopolitical reawakening. Russia's return to Latin America.
Okay, so to truly grasp the contours of Russia's current approach, we really have to travel back in time a bit and establish some historical context.
Right, setting the stage.
After the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Latin America quite literally fell off Russia's foreign policy radar. Yeah. I mean, completely.
It just wasn't a focus.
Not at all. The focus immediately shifted inward, dealing with immense domestic challenges, and then outward towards its immediate neighborhood in Europe. This was a monumental departure from the Cold War era,
Totally different world.
when the Soviet Union maintained a very extensive network of economic, military, and ideological support programs in key countries like Cuba and Nicaragua. They really viewed the region as a vital arena for ideological struggle against the United States back then.
Right. It was almost as if they hit the geopolitical pause button, effectively withdrawing from that entire region. But then, fast forward maybe a decade to the turn of the 21st century, and something fundamental began to shift, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Russia's interest in Latin America slowly but surely started to reawaken.
And what sparked this renewed, almost phoenix-like attention? What changed?
Well, a primary catalyst was the noticeable deterioration of relations between Russia and the United States.
Ah, okay.
As Moscow perceived a cooling, maybe even a hardening, of ties with Washington, it strategically began looking for avenues to reassert its global presence and, frankly, challenge what it saw as unchallenged American hegemony.
Makes sense. Look for other friends, other arenas.
Exactly. And concurrently, the political landscape within Latin America itself became remarkably fertile ground for Russia to re-engage.
Yeah.
This was the era widely known as the Maria Rosa, or the Pink Tide,
Right, I remember that well.
which saw a significant and widespread shift to the political left across the region.
And this pink tide often brought with it leaders who were quite vocal in their anti-American sentiment, didn't it? I mean, you think about charismatic populist figures like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela,
Definitely.
who openly challenged U.S. influence, or Evo Morales in Bolivia, pursuing more independent, sort of socialist-leaning policies. Russia seemed to skillfully capitalize on this anti-establishment, anti-American feeling.
Precisely. Russia found immediate common ground with these new governments, many of whom were actively seeking alternatives to traditional Western partnerships. They wanted options.
Yeah.
The symbolic weight of this re-engagement was vividly articulated by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev himself. During a high-profile regional visit back in 2008, he boldly remarked that Russia had returned to Latin America.
Wow, quite a statement.
It wasn't just a casual observation or some diplomatic nicety, it was a powerful statement of intent, and it quickly became an official pillar of Russia's strategic thinking.
And it certainly wasn't just a passing fancy, was it? By 2016, Latin America became formally integrated into Russia's foreign policy concept. That's their paramount strategic foreign policy document, right? Outlining their global ambitions and priorities.
That's the one.
And this commitment was then further stressed and reinforced, apparently with even greater emphasis, in the 2023 update to that very same document. So it unequivocally signals a deepening and sustained focus on the region.
Yes. The formalization of this strategy truly underscores Russia's overarching strategic goals in Latin America. A primary objective, clearly stated and consistently pursued, is to prevent the United States from having an unchallenged presence in what Russia considers its vicinity.
Its backyard, essentially.
You could say that. It's a direct reactive response to perceived U.S. geopolitical moves, especially things like NATO expansion and U.S. engagement in regions bordering Russia.
So it's certainly about pushing back against U.S. influence, kind of creating a counterbalance. But is it also about fostering something broader, perhaps a different kind of global order?
Absolutely. Beyond merely countering the U.S., Russia harbors a more expansive ambition to ensure that Latin America and the Caribbean remains geopolitically neutral, particularly in the context of Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine.
Why is that neutrality so important to them?
Well, this neutrality is profoundly critical for Russia because it denies the U.S. and its allies an automatic alignment or support from a significant and influential bloc of countries in the global south.
Got it. Keeps them out of the other camp.
Right. Furthermore, Russia has an even grander ambition to position itself at the very heart of a new world order. This is a concept, often referred to by experts as a disorderly world, where Russia actively challenges what it perceives as American-led global hegemony by forging deeper alliances and partnerships with the global south. And Latin America is, without doubt, a crucial piece in this complex puzzle of a multipolar future they envision.
That brings us directly to how Latin America itself navigates this intricate global chessboard. The region has a deeply ingrained traditional stance of what's known as active non-alignment, or ANA. Can you elaborate on what that truly means in practice for these LAC countries?
Yeah, active non-alignment, or ANA, it's Latin America's long-standing, independent, and often fiercely neutral approach in geopolitical rivalries. It fundamentally emphasizes that countries in the region generally do not accept a priori that is, in advance or without independent consideration, the positions of major global powers when those powers are in conflict.
So they decide case by case.
Pretty much. Instead, they consistently claim to act in defense of their own national interests, striving to avoid being pulled into or giving into pressures from any hegemonic powers. It's really a pragmatic strategy designed to avoid the pitfalls of Cold War-era proxy conflicts and maintain maximum autonomy in foreign policy.
But this neutrality isn't entirely straightforward, is it? Because while they might proclaim a desire to stay out of the direct fray, their actions on the global stage, particularly at the United Nations, show a more, nuanced position.
That's true.
For example, most LAC countries, specifically 26 out of 33, voted in favor of UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's war against Ukraine. That included the resolution on Principles of the Charter of the United Nations. That sounds like a pretty clear, unified condemnation of the conflict itself.
It does, and it absolutely represents a significant indicator of their broad disapproval of the war, reflecting their commitment to international law and territorial integrity.
Yeah.
However, and this is key, it's vital to acknowledge the specific exceptions within that vote.
Okay, who didn't vote yes?
Nicaragua, for instance, voted directly against these resolutions. Meanwhile, Bolivia, Cuba, and El Salvador abstained from the vote, effectively choosing not to take a public stand. Additionally, Dominica, Grenada, and Venezuela didn't cast votes at all.
Interesting variation there.
But here is the crucial distinction, and this truly defines the essence of active non-alignment. This UN voting behavior has not translated into concrete policy actions, like joining the comprehensive international sanctions against Russia that have been imposed by Western nations.
So it's a yes, we condemn the war in principle, but no, we won't join your sanctions or provide military aid. Can you give us some concrete examples of how this plays out?
Certainly, consider major regional players like Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Despite their UN votes condemning the invasion, none of these countries have applied sanctions against Russia.
None at all.
No. Nor have they responded positively to persistent calls from the Western alliance to provide weapons or military equipment to Ukraine. In fact, if we look across the entire membership of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, only the Bahamas has actually joined the global sanctions regime against Russia.
Only the Bahamas. Wow.
It vividly demonstrates the region's deep-seated commitment to its principle of active non-alignment, even in the face of significant international pressure.
That's a truly fascinating dichotomy. It highlights the complex balancing act these nations are performing, and it seems there's an ongoing debate among experts about what this position truly signifies for LAC.
Yes, there is.
Some analysts believe the region benefits immensely from remaining a bystander to major geopolitical turmoil, allowing them to focus on domestic development and avoid being drawn into conflicts that aren't directly theirs.
That's one perspective.
But then, other observers express concern that the region might inadvertently be slipping into a kind of Cold War-like polarizing logic, where countries are increasingly, perhaps subtly, compelled to choose sides, even if they claim neutrality.
It's a very real and pressing concern. The dynamic pressures exerted by various global powers, each with their own agendas, could indeed push the region towards a more polarized environment over time. And this would undoubtedly challenge Latin America's long-standing and carefully cultivated active non-alignment, potentially forcing difficult choices that could have significant domestic and regional consequences.
Oh, wait, let's unpack this a bit. How does Russia balance its strong ties with these traditional allies, some of whom are quite isolated internationally, with its ambition to expand influence more broadly across the region? It feels like a very delicate, high-wire act.
It absolutely is. Russia's traditional allies in Latin America are, as you'd expect, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
The usual suspects, so to speak.
Right. These nations represent long-standing political and security partners, often characterized by authoritarian regimes and deep historical ties stemming from the Cold War Soviet era. Cuba and Nicaragua, for example, received extensive economic and military support from the USSR for decades, forging bonds that persist to this day.
And that loyalty continues.
Oh, yes. Russia's unwavering loyalty to these, well, anti-democratic allies was recently demonstrated when it was among the very first to congratulate Nicolas Maduro following Venezuela's presidential elections in July 2024.
Despite all the controversy and fraud allegations.
Exactly. Despite widespread international fraud allegations and a clear lack of international electoral integrity standards, this public endorsement, despite the controversy, underlines the strategic importance Russia places on these core relationships.
So these are the core partners, the ones with a historical bond, often a shared ideological bent, and certainly a willingness to align with Moscow. But Russia isn't stopping there, is it? It seems they're actively trying to broaden their circle beyond these historical strongholds.
No, not at all. Russia is actively and overtly trying to strengthen its ties beyond these traditional allies. Their strategic documents and diplomatic efforts explicitly mention countries like Bolivia, Brazil, and even El Salvador as targets for increased political engagement.
El Salvador is interesting. Central America.
It is. This deliberate expansion demonstrates a clear desire to broaden their reach and not be confined to just a small, somewhat isolated group of nations. They are looking for new opportunities and new partners, even in regions where they traditionally had less sway.
And when we talk about players in the region, Russia isn't operating in a vacuum, obviously. We've got China, a colossal economic force with a massive and ever-growing presence.
Huge.
The Belt and Road, the China CELAC Forum, and of course the European Union with its long-standing strategic partnerships and deep institutional ties. How does Russia's presence and strategy sort of fit in against these other major influencers, given their differing approaches?
Well, what's truly fascinating here is how carefully Latin American and Caribbean countries try to navigate these complex geopolitical waters. They're constantly attempting to maintain their neutrality while still expressing their opinions on global events. It's a real tightrope walk.
Trying to get the benefits without the costs.
In a way, yes. China's economic presence, as you said, has increased dramatically over the past 2 decades through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, with significant infrastructure investments, and through the increasingly prominent China CELAC Forum summits.
Big money flowing in.
Definitely. The EU, on the other hand, has a very different approach. A long-standing strategic partnership with CELAC, bolstered by an extensive network of comprehensive association and trade agreements.
More institutionalized.
Exactly. And after a period of relative quiet, the EU visibly revived its interest in the region post-Ukraine war, holding a significant EU-CELAC summit in July 2023, with another already scheduled for Colombia in 2025.
So the EU is stepping up its game too.
They are. Russia, in many respects, is clearly playing catch-up in terms of broad economic engagement, but it does so with a highly targeted and strategic approach, leveraging specific weaknesses or opportunities where it can find them. 2. Russia's political engagement, building bridges and forums.
Okay, moving on to Russia's political engagement specifically. It's evident they've been incredibly busy building diplomatic bridges and fostering new forums. Over the past 2 decades, they've established a whole range of bilateral cooperation agreements with Latin American countries, touching on critical areas like security, trade, energy, and military cooperation. We're talking about nations like Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Quite a list.
That's right. While that list sounds extensive, and it is in terms of reach, it's critically important to emphasize that Russia's institutionalized relationships are generally at a comparably lower level than, say, the EU's intensive dialogue mechanisms and comprehensive trade agreements.
Right, you mentioned the EU's network earlier.
Yeah, the EU, for example, boasts this dense web of association, trade, investment, political, and cooperation agreements with 27 out of the 33 LAC countries. It's incredibly broad and deep.
And Russia?
In stark contrast, Russia holds no overarching association or free trade agreement with any LAC country. Zero. Analysts consistently point out that the various negotiation platforms where Russia and LAC countries are present have an extremely weak, almost symbolic economic component. They're more political than economic.
So it's more about strategic partnerships and specific, maybe opportunistic cooperation areas rather than broad, deep institutional ties that underpin, say, the EU's relationships.
That seems to be the case.
And the 2023 foreign policy concept really zeroes in on a select few key countries of interest for Russia, doesn't it? It's not trying to be everything to everyone.
It absolutely does. While they engage broadly, Brazil, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are explicitly highlighted in the concept as countries of specific and primary interest for sustained engagement.
The core group again.
Yes. And interestingly, El Salvador is also now garnering increased attention from Russia, which is notable, as you said, because it's a country in Central America, a region where the EU already has a strong and comprehensive association agreement.
So they're pushing into EU territory, so to speak.
It illustrates Russia's selective and highly focused approach to building political ties, where it perceives distinct strategic advantages or a potential to challenge established Western influence.
Beyond just bilateral ties, Russia has also made concerted efforts to engage with the region as a whole through multilateral forums. A prime example is the Russia-CELAC Permanent Mechanism for Political Dialogue and Cooperation, initially launched way back in 2015.
Right, though it hasn't always been super active.
True. Although it hasn't been a consistently active platform for deep policy coordination, Russia remains committed, explicitly announcing plans in 2023 to resume and invigorate its activities.
These multilateral forums are absolutely crucial for diplomatic visibility and for cultivating broader political relationships beyond just individual states. You see the importance Russia places on the region through the steady stream of high-level visits too.
Like Lavrov's tours.
Exactly. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, for instance, completed an extensive four-country tour in April 2023, Brazil, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And he even met with Bolivian emissaries while he was in Venezuela.
Covering the key partners.
Then he returned again in February 2024, revisiting Venezuela, Cuba, and Brazil, where he participated in the crucial G20 foreign ministers meeting in Rio de Janeiro.
Showing up for the big meetings.
And additionally, Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, who's a very close confidant of President Putin, also undertook a significant visit to the region in 2024. That underscores the high-level attention Moscow is paying.
These repeated high-profile visits aren't just for show, are they? They signal a genuine, ongoing commitment and a significant expenditure of diplomatic energy and resources. What's the deeper significance of these tours?
Well, they absolutely signal Moscow's serious long-term commitment. They serve multiple purposes. They reaffirm existing alliances, they explore new avenues for cooperation, and they project an image of Russia as a reliable and accessible global partner, particularly to those nations wary of Western dominance.
Presenting an alternative.
Precisely. Furthermore, Russia is increasingly leveraging international conferences on its own soil. They hosted the first ever Russia-Latin America International Parliamentary Conference in September-October 2023.
Oh, I heard about that.
Yeah, it saw over 200 delegates from various Latin American countries converge in Moscow. President Putin himself addressed the participants, powerfully emphasizing Russia's willingness to work closely with Latin American associations, and even help them establish practical ties with the Eurasian Economic Union.
Russia's own economic bloc.
Right. This sends a clear signal of Russia's ambition to integrate Latin America into its broader vision for a multipolar economic and political order.
Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. How does Russia manage to shift the narrative, or at least soften the diplomatic stance in forums like the G20? Even while many LAC countries condemn its actions at the UN, what's at play behind that subtle yet significant diplomatic maneuvering?
This raises a profoundly important question, doesn't it? Is Russia's strategy purely about exerting raw power, or is there a genuine underlying desire among some LA's countries to see a more multipolar world where global influence is distributed beyond just a single hegemonic power?
A desire for balance, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Okay.
Because in forums like BRICS, the intergovernmental organization that initially included Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and then dramatically expanded in early 2024 to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE.
Right, the big expansion.
In BRICS, Russia finds a cornerstone for its foreign policy ambition to create that very new multipolar world order.
So BRICS isn't just an economic bloc, it's explicitly a geopolitical tool for Russia to challenge the existing global structure.
Precisely. One of Russia's explicit objectives within BRICS is to systematically weaken the U.S. dollar-based international financial system and, in its place, establish a, quote, sanctions-proof payment system that can operate outside Western control.
De-dollarization efforts.
Exactly. This forum offers Russia a powerful platform to strengthen its relations with Brazil, a crucial regional player and founding BRICS member, and to actively encourage other LAC countries, most notably Bolivia and Venezuela, to join its expanded ranks.
And Brazil's still on board?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Brazil's president, Lula da Silva, has already confirmed his plan to attend the 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia. That underscores this ongoing high-level engagement and a clear desire by Brazil to remain deeply involved.
That's a truly significant show of support for BRICS and, by extension, for Russia's vision. But there was also a notable case of a major country pulling back from planned BRICS entry, wasn't there? Argentina.
Yes, Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, famously withdrew the country from its planned BRICS entry shortly after taking office. That certainly underscores the complexities and inherent unpredictability of regional alignment, particularly with shifts in domestic political leadership.
It absolutely does. And it serves as a powerful reminder that while Russia is actively trying to expand its sphere of influence, sovereign nations in Latin America are still making independent decisions based on their own perceived national interests and, well, the ideological direction of their new political leadership.
Definitely. Beyond BRICS, Russia also regularly engages with LAC countries at the G20 Intergovernmental Forum, which notably includes Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico.
The big regional economies.
Right. And if we compare the leaders' communiques from the 2022 and 2023 G20 summits, it strongly suggests that Russia's relentless diplomatic efforts are, well, paying off.
How so?
While the 2022 communique explicitly deplored Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the 2023 one deliberately avoided explicit condemnation. The language was much softer.
That's a stark contrast in language. It certainly indicates a softening of the diplomatic stance, which, for Russia, is undoubtedly a significant diplomatic win, even if it's not an outright endorsement of its actions.
Exactly. And a similar dynamic played out at the 2023 EU CELAC summit. The declaration issued regarding Russia's war against Ukraine was notably watered down, specifically because of LAC's insistent demand for a more neutral stance in the text.
Interesting. So LAC pushed back against stronger language.
They did. It will be particularly interesting to observe how this sensitive issue is addressed, or perhaps carefully avoided, at the upcoming 2024 G20 Rio de Janeiro summit, with Brazil hosting.
Yeah, that'll be one to watch.
This pattern aligns with what's often termed the one hand washes the other principle. Russia supports Latin America in its longstanding efforts to achieve greater representation and a stronger voice in influential international forums, like the UN Security Council and the G20.
And a return.
In return, it implicitly seeks diplomatic favor, or at the very least, a softening of criticism regarding its actions on the global stage.
And we even saw this principle play out with the whole International Criminal Court arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin situation.
Right, that was quite something.
Brazilian President Lula da Silva initially stated that Brazil, despite being a signatory of the Rome Statute, might ignore the warrant if Putin were to attend the G20 in Rio.
Though he did walk that back later.
He did, after significant international and domestic pressure, but the initial statement was telling. And the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also publicly rejected Ukraine's request to arrest Putin if he attended the Mexican presidential inauguration. These are highly visible diplomatic moments, aren't they? Revealing the complex calculus at play.
They absolutely are. And they clearly illustrate how Russia leverages these carefully cultivated relationships to gain crucial diplomatic leverage and avoid international isolation, even from countries that might vocally condemn its actions in other contexts, like the UN. It demonstrates the profound depth of the active non-alignment strategy practiced by many LAC nations, which often prioritizes perceived national interest and diplomatic maneuvering over strict adherence to external pressures or international legal mandates that could complicate their own global position. 3. The economic footprint. Small, but strategically leveraged.
Now, if we shift our gaze from the grand political stage to the cold, hard numbers of economic reality, a stark picture emerges. While Russia plays a sophisticated diplomatic game, its economic footprint in Latin America is, by all accounts, surprisingly, almost shockingly limited.
It really is.
But here's the twist. Limited doesn't necessarily mean insignificant, right?
You've hit on the core paradox there. Russia's overall economic presence is indeed very limited, especially when you compare it to economic giants like China, the United States, and the European Union.
Night and day difference.
Absolutely. For example, as we mentioned, Russia has no overarching association or comprehensive free trade agreements in place with any LAC country. That's a stark contrast to the EU's incredibly extensive network covering 27 out of the 33 countries.
Right.
Furthermore, most analysts agree that the existing negotiation platforms where Russia and LAC countries meet have an extremely weak economic component. They often serve more as political dialogue forums than genuine trade accelerators.
And the trade statistics really hammer this home, don't they? Less than 2% of Russia's global trade is with Latin America. That's tiny.
It is. In 2022, for instance, a mere 0.86% of all LAC imports came from Russia, and an even smaller 0.34% of LAC exports went to Russia.
Wow. Compare that to the U.S., which was LAC's leading trading partner at 38% back in 2020, China at 18%, and the EU at 11%. Russia's barely a blip on the overall radar.
Exactly. And when it comes to foreign direct investment, FDI, the numbers are equally telling. Russia's total direct investment in the region hovers around a paltry U.S. $100 million.
Just $100 million for the whole region.
Roughly, yes. Right. Which is widely considered insignificant in the grand scheme of regional investment flows. Now, this figure likely excludes investments routed through various tax havens to mask the true origin, so the real number might be a bit higher.
Sure, hidden money.
But compare that to the EU, which stands as the largest foreign investor in the region by far, with FDI stocks amounting to a colossal $687.5 billion.
Billion with a B. Huge difference.
Huge. However, it is acknowledged that the true size of Russian FDI stocks is likely somewhat larger due to those investments made via subsidiaries located in tax havens like the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland. And these investments tend to be strategically concentrated in specific high-value sectors like oil and gas in countries such as Bolivia, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela.
So while their overall economic presence is small, they're not just casting a wide net, they're very strategically focused on certain sectors and specific countries. Who are their absolute top economic priorities in the region?
Russia's top economic priorities in LAC are clearly Brazil and Mexico, which makes sense as they represent the region's two largest economies.
Right.
They are followed by Argentina and Ecuador.
Mm-hmm.
Collectively, trade with just these four countries alone accounts for 3/4 of Russia's entire trade volume with the whole LAC region.
3/4 just from 4 countries. That's concentration.
It is. To put some numbers on it, Brazil's trade with Russia amounted to a significant U.S. $9.8 billion in 2022, reflecting its critical role. Meanwhile, trade with Mexico, while smaller, still registered at U.S. $1.12 billion in the same year. This highlights a very concentrated effort rather than a diffuse engagement.
What about the impact of the sweeping US and EU sanctions against Russia? Russia's war in Ukraine triggered a massive wave of these measures. How has that directly affected Latin America's economies? Has it hurt them much?
Well, the direct immediate impact of U.S. and EU sanctions against Russia on Latin America has been perhaps surprisingly rather limited.
Why is that?
It's largely because Russia's overall economic footprint in the region was already so small to begin with, so cutting off that small amount didn't cause huge waves across the board.
Yeah.
However, the broader economic fallout from the war itself in Ukraine has certainly led to asymmetric negative economic effects across LAC. These effects have been most acutely felt by energy and agri-food importers, particularly vulnerable nations in Central America and the Caribbean, which rely heavily on global markets for staples.
So higher food and energy prices hit them hard.
Exactly. Low-income households in these areas have been disproportionately affected by increases in global food prices and extreme volatility in commodity markets. Now, to mitigate these negative effects for its closest allies and, maintain their loyalty,
Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela.
right, Russia has actively signed bilateral economic cooperation agreements with them, essentially offering lifelines to cushion the blow of the conflict for those key partners.
So what does this all mean for Latin American economies? It seems like while Russia's overall economic footprint is genuinely small, its targeted leverage on certain critical goods, particularly in specific countries, gives it a disproportionate amount of influence. How exactly do they manage to achieve that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really highlights how resource dependence can be an incredibly powerful geopolitical tool, often far more potent than simple overall trade volumes might suggest.
Right.
Despite Russia's limited overall trade, it gained significant political leverage by meticulously exploiting certain Latin American and Caribbean countries' reliance on specific, often vital, Russian products or technologies. It's about finding those critical choke points.
That's where it gets truly interesting. What are these strategic dependencies that Russia so skillfully leverages? Give us some examples.
One of the most significant is undoubtedly fertilizers. Russia is the world's biggest supplier of fertilizers, covering approximately 22% of Latin America's total needs.
Wow, over a fifth.
That gives Russia immense leverage, particularly with agricultural powerhouses like Brazil. Consider this. Brazil, as a major global supplier of agricultural products, the world breadbasket as you called it,
Yeah.
is the single largest buyer of Russian fertilizers globally.
Mm.
It relies on Russia for a quarter of all its fertilizer imports.
A quarter. That's huge dependency.
It is. This reliance isn't just economic. It's almost existential for Brazil's massive agricultural sector. Many observers suspect this deep dependence is a key, perhaps unspoken reason Brazil has consistently steered clear of participating in any economic sanctions against Russia.
It's a powerful geopolitical handcuff, as you said.
It really is.
So Brazil's very food security and agricultural productivity are directly tied to Russia's fertilizer supply, creating a powerful, almost unshakable incentive for non-alignment on the global stage.
Are there other countries similarly dependent on Russian fertilizer?
Yes, many other LAC countries, including Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela, are to a greater or lesser extent also dependent on Russian fertilizers for their agricultural output. It's a widespread leverage point.
Okay, fertilizers is one major one. What else?
Beyond fertilizers, there's also the burgeoning trade in oil and diesel. Since the war in Ukraine, there's been a truly significant and frankly eye-opening increase in Russian oil product imports to LAC. They're reaching 300 to 330,000 barrels per day. That's a lot of barrels finding a new home.
It is. This represents approximately 5% of Russia's total global oil sales, a notable redirection of energy exports away from sanctioned markets.
And Brazil is once again a major player here, isn't it? It seems to be a recurring theme that keep popping up.
Indeed. In 2023, Brazil actually overtook Turkey to become the single largest buyer of Russian diesel globally.
The largest in the world.
Yes. Importing a massive 6.1 million tons. That's an astonishing 6 times more than it did in 2022.
6 times. Incredible jump.
Similarly, its fuel oil imports from Russia also grew dramatically, skyrocketing from about US $1.1 billion in 2022 to US $5.3 billion in 2023. These numbers clearly illustrate a strategic and rapid shift in global supply chains, with Brazil stepping in quite significantly to absorb Russian energy products no longer flowing to traditional European markets.
We even have a concrete anecdote that perfectly illustrates how Russia uses trade as a direct geopolitical tool, turning an economic lever into a political pressure point. The recent case of Ecuador and its banana exports immediately comes to mind.
Ah, yes, the banana diplomacy. a perfect and very stark example.
What happened there exactly?
Well, in January 2024, Ecuador was publicly considering accepting a U.S. offer to exchange its aging, Soviet-era military equipment for modern U.S. weapons. The U.S. intention was for these Soviet-era arms to then be shipped to Ukraine to aid in its defense effort.
Okay, makes sense from the U.S.-Ukraine perspective.
But Russia's response was swift, brutal, and highly impactful. They immediately announced significant limitations and outright bans on banana imports from Ecuador, citing rather dubious phytosanitary concerns.
Suddenly, Ecuadorian bananas weren't safe.
Apparently not, according to Moscow. And just 1 month later, under this undeniable economic pressure, because bananas are a huge export for Ecuador,
Right, critical industry.
Ecuador's government formally canceled the military exchange plan. This incident vividly demonstrates Russia's willingness to use economic coercion and trade relationships as powerful tools to directly influence and even reverse the political decisions of sovereign nations.
That's a direct, almost immediate consequence, a real-time display of economic leverage in action. Pretty blunt.
Very blunt.
Beyond current trade, there's also this growing global race for critical raw materials, and lithium, often called white gold, is a major one. Latin America plays an absolutely huge role here, doesn't it, given its vast reserves?
It absolutely does.
Mm.
Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru, the so-called lithium triangle plus Peru, collectively hold about 2/3 of the world's proven lithium reserves,
2/3.
which makes the region a global linchpin for the future of electric vehicles, battery storage, the whole green energy transition. Now, these countries, especially Bolivia perhaps, often lack the indigenous technological capabilities or the financial resources to independently operate and develop large-scale lithium mining and processing projects.
So they need partners.
They need partners.
Yeah.
This significant capacity gap opens the door wide for international partnerships and, of course, for geopolitical competition among major powers wanting access.
And Russia has already made a very significant, almost pioneering move in Bolivia, which boasts some of the world's largest, though largely undeveloped, lithium deposits.
Exactly. In 2023, Bolivia signed a landmark U.S. $450 million deal with the Russian state firm Uranium One Group. Now, that's a subsidiary of Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear energy corporation.
Interesting that a nuclear company is getting into lithium.
Well, it's all strategic resources. This deal directly grants Russia access to Bolivia's estimated 23 million tons of lithium reserves. It's an incredibly strategic move for Moscow to secure long-term access to a critical material that is absolutely essential for the global energy transition.
Locking in future supply.
Precisely. It will be fascinating to follow this development, especially as the European Commission has also publicly announced its own plan to establish a critical raw materials club with interested LAC countries, highlighting the escalating global competition for these vital resources. Everyone wants a piece of that lithium pie. Far 4, military cooperation and its decline.
Okay, let's shift gears now to military cooperation. It's clear that Russia's military presence and activities in Latin America are considered a key component of what's been termed its symbolic reciprocity strategy. What exactly does that rather academic-sounding phrase mean in practical terms? What's the symbolism?
It's a fascinating concept, really, and it reveals Russia's strategic mindset. Essentially, it's a direct, almost tit-for-tat reaction to perceived U.S. actions near Russia's borders,
Like what?
particularly things like the expansion of NATO and U.S. military engagements in regions like Ukraine. Russia views its military presence, however limited it might be in reality in Latin America, as a reciprocal way to project influence and push back against what it sees as U.S. encroachment into its own neighborhood.
So it's a strategic message. If you operate in our traditional sphere of influence, we'll demonstrate our reach into yours.
That's basically it. And Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela remain Russia's undisputed core security partners in this regard. These are nations that have historically been and continue to be antagonistic towards Washington.
And what do these military cooperation agreements with these traditional allies typically entail? Is it just arms sales, or is it deeper than that?
Oh, they're certainly deeper than just transactional arms sales, though those are a component. They focus on a range of activities. Extensive equipment sales, especially in the past. Crucial maintenance support for legacy Soviet-era hardware, which these countries still operate.
Keeping the old gear running.
Right. Joint training exercises for military personnel. And symbolic naval and air deployments that demonstrate Russia's long-range projection capabilities, even if infrequent.
Like sending bombers or ships on visits.
Exactly. Intelligence sharing is also a significant, though less visible, aspect of this cooperation. And remember, there were even widely reported instances of Wagner Group members, The Russian private military
Oh,
company,
Wagner.
being present in Caracas back in 2019, ostensibly providing security for Nicolas Maduro following major protests against his rule. This highlights the extent and varied nature of this security cooperation, moving beyond traditional state-to-state military ties into more shadowy, unconventional forms of support.
While those traditional allies are undeniably key, Russia has also publicly stated its ambition to broaden its military ties across the region. The 2023 foreign policy concept explicitly highlights Russia's stated effort to promote and expand security, military, and military technical cooperation with any, quote, interested Latin American countries beyond its core partners. What has that expansion looked like on the ground? Has it happened?
Well, indeed, Russia has made efforts to expand its network. They have concluded bilateral security and military cooperation agreements with a broader range of nations, including Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, El Salvador, Paraguay, and Peru.
So the agreements exist on paper.
Yes. And if we look at the historical data for recipients of Russian armaments since 2007, the list includes Argentina, Ecuador, Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela. Now, Venezuela in particular stands out as by far the primary recipient of Russian arms in the region during this period. That was a crucial client-state relationship for Moscow's arms industry.
But here's where we see a truly fascinating contrast, and you hinted at it. While military cooperation remains a stated goal and a symbolic gesture of defiance against the U.S., the actual sales figures tell a very different reality. It seems Russia's presence in the Latin American arms market has steadily and significantly declined since around 2017.
This raises that profoundly important question again. Is Russia's military strategy in Latin America more about optics and disruption, that symbolic reciprocity, than about any substantial practical power projection through actual arms sales these days?
Seems like it might be. Why the decline?
Experts overwhelmingly attribute this dramatic decline to the crippling U.S. sanctions imposed after Russia's initial invasion of Crimea in 2014, and especially intensified after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
The CATASA sanctions and others.
Exactly. These sanctions were specifically designed to target Russia's military and intelligence sectors, including its formidable arms industry, Rosaboron export, and others.
So the sanctions are really biting here, affecting their ability to actually supply weapons and parts. What are the practical implications for a Latin American country trying to acquire or maintain Russian military equipment now?
Absolutely. The sanctions are biting hard. This wasn't just a political statement from the U.S. It created immense practical hurdles. Countries that historically relied on Russian equipment suddenly found it extremely difficult, as one source puts it, to bear the political costs, let alone the severe financial and technological risks of purchasing or even maintaining Russian military equipment.
How so? What are the risks?
Think about it. Securing spare parts for maintenance becomes a logistical nightmare. Where do you get them if the supply chain is sanctioned? Processing payments for new systems risks triggering secondary sanctions from the U.S., potentially cutting off a nation from the global financial system, especially dollar transactions.
Huge risk.
And integrating Russian technology with existing Western-supplied systems becomes nearly impossible due to compatibility issues and this sanction-induced isolation. This forces Latin American nations to fundamentally pivot their defense strategies, often reluctantly, towards suppliers who can guarantee continuity of supply, maintenance, and, crucially, avoid that diplomatic fallout with their larger trading partners, particularly the U.S.
So the practical difficulties of procurement and the risks associated with violating U.S. sanctions heavily outweigh any potential ideological alignment or desire for Russian gear for most LAC countries in this specific sector now.
Exactly. According to SIPR, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is a leading authority on global arms transfers, there have been no publicly announced deliveries of significant Russian arms and military equipment to LAC countries since 2018.
Since 2018.
Wow. Yeah. Russia now holds a truly negligible share of the Latin American arms market, something like 0.22%. Compare that to the United States, which utterly dominates at 50% market share.
Half the market.
The overwhelming power of Western countries' massive sanctions means it will remain extremely difficult for LAC countries to justify the political, financial, and technological risks of purchasing Russian military equipment. It's widely anticipated that the U.S. and EU defense industries will continue to consolidate their dominance in the Latin American market for the foreseeable future. Russia's military influence seems destined to be more about historical ties and symbolic gestures than current active arms trade. V. The disinformation battleground. Shaping Narratives in LAC.
Now, something we absolutely have to touch on, which has truly become a crucial, almost invisible element in modern geopolitics, the disinformation battleground. It's clear from our sources that disinformation and targeted propaganda campaigns are considered a critical element in Russia's overarching strategy for Latin America.
They absolutely are. And it's a deliberate, well-funded, and sophisticated effort. Russian state-backed media outlets like the Sputnik News Agency and the overtly propagandistic TV channel Russia Today, or RT.
RT on Espanol.
Exactly. They didn't just appear overnight. They strategically opened offices in Latin America as far back as 2014, right around the time of the Crimea annexation. Since then, they have systematically and steadily expanded their Spanish-language reporting and broadcasting, investing heavily in building a regional presence.
And what are the primary goals of this Russian propaganda machine operating in the region? Is it simply about promoting Russia, or is there a more, well, insidious agenda at play?
Primarily, these campaigns are aimed squarely at undermining the standing and influence of the United States throughout the region. That seems to be goal number one.
Sowing distrust of the U.S.
Precisely. Beyond that, there's a significant concerted effort to whitewash Russia's image in world affairs, specifically regarding its war against Ukraine, attempting to reframe the conflict, justify it, or downplay its brutality. And crucially, they also work hard to portray Russia as an effective, even perhaps superior, alternative political and economic model to liberal democracy, trying to appeal to nations or populations disillusioned with Western systems or feeling neglected by them.
So it's a multi-pronged, comprehensive effort to shape narratives and shift perceptions across the board.
Very much so.
How successful have these influence campaigns truly been? We have a comprehensive 2023 report titled Russian Influence Campaigns in Latin America, supported by the United States Institute of Peace. What did it conclude?
That report concluded, quite starkly, that Russia successfully uses disinformation, economic coercion, and covert and overt political action in Latin America. It didn't mince words.
And what are the tangible consequences of this multifaceted approach, according to the report?
The report unequivocally states that by employing these tactics, Moscow has effectively sowed anti-U.S. sentiment and weakened democratic institutions while shaping the behavior of Latin American governments in Russia's favor.
Wow. Weakening democratic institutions. That's serious.
It is. It's a potent cocktail. Russia uses highly targeted communications tailored to country-specific topics and local grievances, making its messages resonate more effectively locally. Furthermore, its ambassadors play an incredibly crucial, almost activist role.
More than just diplomats.
Far more. They function as legitimized spokespersons in national media, actively placing op-eds in local newspapers, conducting interviews on local radio and TV, all to articulate the Kremlin's narratives directly to Latin American audiences. This lends an air of official credibility to often biased or sometimes completely fabricated information.
It's a fascinating cat-and-mouse game, isn't it? On one hand, you have these persistent and sophisticated disinformation campaigns, but on the other, public perception doesn't always align with the narrative Russia pushes. Sometimes it even seems to decrease.
That's true.
What's truly fascinating here is how important narrative control has become in modern geopolitics. It seems almost as important as economic or military power. It's a constant battle for hearts and minds.
It absolutely highlights that. The ability to shape public opinion and control information flow is now a central pillar of statecraft for many actors, not just Russia. In response to this growing threat, the U.S. has retaliated, imposing new sanctions specifically on Russian state media outlets.
Treating them as propaganda arms?
Viewing them not as independent news organizations, but as integral parts of Russia's intelligence and operations apparatus. The European Parliament has also been very vocal and proactive on this front.
What have they done?
They've passed several resolutions, including one back in 2020, specifically on COVID-19-related disinformation, and another in 2024 focused on common foreign and security policy. Both explicitly urged the EU Commission and its delegations abroad to rigorously counter aggressive Russian and Chinese propaganda that aims to undermine the EU's credibility and sow mistrust within partner countries.
So, telling their diplomats to fight back.
Yes. Their directives specifically stress the urgent need to increase public diplomacy efforts and develop robust strategic communication capabilities to effectively fight this wave of disinformation.
So there's a strong, coordinated international effort, at least from the West, to counter this. But despite all these persistent propaganda efforts and the vast resources Russia pours into them, has Russia's image in Latin America suffered at all because of the undeniable realities of the war against Ukraine? Is the reality cutting through the noise?
It seems it has, significantly so. While the propaganda is pervasive, it hasn't completely swayed public opinion or prevented a discernible backlash. A 2024 report from the Center for the Study of Democracy, CSD, showed a notable 15% decrease in positive perception towards Russia in Latin America since its initial invasion of Crimea back in 2014.
A 15% drop, that's quite substantial.
It suggests that despite the sophisticated narratives being pushed, the tangible actions on the global stage, particularly the brutal realities of the full-scale war in Ukraine, are breaking through and influencing how Latin Americans view Russia. The battle for narrative control is definitely ongoing, but it's clearly not a unilateral victory for Moscow. Reality still matters. 6. Prospects for EU relations with Latin America and the Caribbean.
Finally, let's pivot to the prospects for European Union relations with Latin America and the Caribbean, especially, against this backdrop of Russia's persistent efforts to expand its influence in the region. It seems the EU now has even more compelling reasons to strengthen its own ties there, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Against the backdrop of Russia's multifaceted and often opportunistic efforts to foster relations, the European Union has, as one analysis put it, more reason than ever to not only continue but actively accelerate the strengthening of its ties with LAC in the coming years.
It's become more urgent for the EU.
It seems so.
Yeah.
This is not merely about diplomatic engagement, it's really a strategic imperative now. A stronger, more robust EU-LAC partnership is crucial to prevent Russia from expanding what is currently still a rather limited, albeit strategically targeted, influence.
Right, keep them contained.
It is therefore key that Latin America remains high on the EU's external agenda, and that both partners significantly enhance their bi-regional relations by rigorously following up on the commitments made at that significant 2023 EU-CELAC summit. The stakes are clearly higher now than they were maybe 5–10 years ago.
So what does this all mean for the future of EU-LAC relations? It seems the EU recognizes the urgency of reinforcing its own relationships, particularly given its established historical and economic ties. Are we seeing concrete progress on the EU's part to deepen these partnerships? Are they putting their money where their mouth is?
Yes, there is tangible progress, indicating a renewed sense of purpose from the EU side. The new EU-Chile Advanced Framework Agreement, which should soon enter into force, is an incredibly important step forward. It modernizes and significantly expands a long-standing partnership.
Updating an old agreement?
Exactly. Additionally, there are two crucial pending trade agreements that the EU is eager to advance. One with Mexico, the modernized EU-Mexico Global Agreement, and of course the big one, the agreement with the Mercosur bloc.
Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, that's been dragging on forever.
It has. But the European Parliament, in its February 2024 resolutions, explicitly emphasized that it is high time to make decisive progress towards the signing and ratification of the EU-Mexico Agreement and to finally conclude the long-negotiated agreement with Mercosur. There's renewed political push.
So maybe some movement there, finally.
Hopefully. These are not just any trade deals. These are comprehensive strategic agreements that offer deep, long-term partnerships spanning not just trade, but also political dialogue, cooperation on shared values, environmental standards, and more.
This raises an important question, though. Can the EU's established, comprehensive, and let's say values-based partnerships effectively counter Russia's more opportunistic and targeted approach in the long run, especially with Russia's potent disinformation campaigns, which we just discussed, being so prevalent and insidious across the region? It feels like a battle of two very different strategies.
It's a critical challenge, and it really is a battle of contrasting strategies. The EU's strength lies in its comprehensive, values-based approach, its deep historical and cultural ties, and the sheer volume of its economic engagement, trade, and investment.
Which Russia can't match overall.
Right. However, to effectively counter Russia's more agile, targeted tactics, especially in the realm of narrative warfare, the EU needs to be far more proactive and perhaps more visible on the ground.
Less bureaucratic, maybe.
Perhaps less Brussels-centric, more localized. The European Parliament's February 2024 resolution clearly stresses the crucial need for relevant EU delegations in Latin America to have the necessary means and resources to significantly increase their public diplomacy activities, and crucially, to develop robust strategic communication capabilities to effectively fight against the pervasive disinformation and propaganda emanating from the Kremlin and other actors.
So empowering the embassies more.
Exactly. The success of the EU strategy hinges on not just the depth of its agreements, but its ability to be actively, consistently, and visibly present, shaping the narrative, demonstrating its value as a reliable partner, and effectively countering falsehoods in a fiercely competitive geopolitical landscape. It needs to compete in the information space just as much as the economic one.
This has been a truly enlightening deep dive. We've thoroughly unpacked Russia's strategic re-engagement with Latin America, driven by this desire for a multipolar world order and, frankly, a direct response to perceived U.S. influence.
hmm
We've seen how it leverages political and economic vulnerabilities, particularly through dependencies on critical goods like fertilizers and oil, giving it disproportionate influence despite having that relatively small overall economic footprint.
The targeted leverage is key.
We've also explored the significant decline in its military cooperation, mainly due to the biting impact of sanctions, and the crucial ongoing role of sophisticated disinformation campaigns in shaping perceptions across the region.
A complex picture.
And all this unfolds while Latin America maintains its complex, nuanced, and often fiercely independent stance of active non-alignment.
It's a dynamic and evolving landscape, isn't it? It underscores that global power plays are rarely one-dimensional or easily categorized. The subtle interplay of history, economics, security, and narrative control truly defines this complex relationship.
So, as you, our listeners, go about your day, consider this. In a world increasingly shaped by competing geopolitical narratives and a scramble for critical resources, how might a region like Latin America continue to define its own unique path? How can it balance immediate self-interest with broader global responsibilities, especially when faced with pressures from all sides, from Russia, from China, from the US, from the EU?
Yeah, how do they navigate that?
Keep an eye on the news, keep an eye on these dynamics, and I promise you'll start to see these subtle levers of influence and power at play, often in the most unexpected places.
It's a question that will continue to shape international relations and the global balance of power for years to come. Absolutely fascinating to watch.
Join us next time on The Deep Dive.